So, you want to own a movie theater. Picture your best possible night. A blockbuster opens, every seat sold, every showing, all weekend. The lobby is chaos. That is the weekend you keep the smallest share of every ticket you will sell all year. Not because something went wrong, because that's how the contract is written. You will not choose what plays on your screens. You will not set the terms of what you keep. You are opening a store where a stranger stocks the shelves, sets the prices, and takes most of the till. So here's a question worth $200 million. In 2024, a Hollywood studio bought 35 theaters. In an industry the financial press had already buried, it didn't do it to save the movies. It did it to own the rooms. Remember that word, rooms. It's going to mean something very specific and not what you think. 3 things you don't know yet. The most important number in this business is printed nowhere on your ticket. The popcorn isn't a snack, it's the entire business model wearing a costume, and the single best-run theater chain in America still ended up in bankruptcy court. Start with what it costs to get in. 3 doors into this industry, they look like the same business at 3 sizes. They're not. They're 3 different businesses, and only one of them is really a business at all. Door 1 is the small town. About 100 single-screen theaters are still running in the United States, and plenty change hands for less than a suburban house. The Key Theater in Keister, Minnesota, is one. 80 years old, 300 seats, town population 462. A former mayor and his wife bought it in 1986. 4 years later they gave it away, not sold to another operator, handed to a non-profit. And then they joined the board so they could keep running the thing they'd just stopped owning. Park that. It's going to explain something the industry never says out loud. Door 2, the modern multiplex. Here the numbers change shape completely. One owner who built new auditoriums from scratch put the equipment alone at roughly $200,000 per screen. Premium large format, the wall-to-wall picture with the branded sound, about $375,000. That's the machinery only, not the building, not the seats, not the carpet. So an 8-screen theater has around $2 million bolted to the walls before one customer walks in. $2 million of hardware that does nothing, earns nothing, and is worth nothing unless Hollywood decides to send you something to put on it, which is the whole problem. And we'll get to how bad it is. Door 3 is the one professionals use. You don't buy a theater, you buy a chain. June 2024. Sony Pictures buys Alamo Drafthouse for a reported $200 million, first major Hollywood studio to own a theater circuit in 75 years. 75 is an oddly exact number for a coincidence. It isn't one. In 1948, an antitrust ruling banned studios from owning the theaters that played their films. Hollywood spent 3/4 of a century locked out of the building. Those rules were quietly retired in 2020. 4 years later, a studio walked through the unlocked door and bought the rooms. Why it wanted them is the question this whole thing turns on, and you can't answer it until you see what happens to the money. Sold out weekend, every seat. Where does the money go? The industry calls it film rental, sliding scale. Opening week, the distributor takes the larger share, often leaving the theater around 30% of the gross. Each week after, the split moves a little your way. By week 5, you might keep half or more. Sounds fine. Until you learn how films behave. A typical movie earns around 30% of its entire domestic run in the opening weekend alone, so run that together. Your share is worst when the building is full. Your share is best when the building is empty. By the time the terms finally favor you, you're playing to 9 people and a cleaner. That isn't bad luck. That's the design. Now the number that should stop you. Regal, filing its accounts in an earlier era, took in roughly $1.8 billion at the box office. It paid out about $954 million of it as film rental, just under 52%, gone before payroll, before electricity, before the mortgage. The box office, the number this entire industry reports and celebrates and panics over, is a number you only half own. And there's a clause in these contracts that gives the whole game away. Exhibitors call their weekly operating cost the nut: rent, staff, power, insurance, the dead weight of opening the doors whether 40 people show up or 4,000. In many deals, the theatre is allowed to subtract the nut before the split is calculated at all. Ask why that clause exists. It exists because the rules of this industry are written around the assumption that the theatre might not cover its own costs, might have a bad year, might not cover the lights. So if tickets are shared and the shared half is the bigger half, a theatre has to be selling something else, something it keeps every cent of. It isn't on the screen, it's 40 feet behind you. Start with the part nobody tells you. Concession revenue is not shared with the studio, not a penny of it. Ticket money gets split, popcorn money doesn't. Now the cost? A serving of popcorn costs a theatre under 50 cents to make. Kernels, oil, a paper bucket, a squirt of butter-flavored topping. It sells for $8 or $9. Gross margins on concessions sit around 85%. Look at the filings and the scale gets absurd. Across a stretch of AMC and Cinemark's reported years, concessions brought in roughly $1.1 billion against a cost of about $181 million. Stanford researchers put the sharpest number on it. Concessions are around 20% of a theatre's gross revenue and roughly 40% of its profit, which flips the entire business upside down. The film is not the product. The film is the reason a human being is standing in a lobby 20 minutes early with nothing to do and nowhere else to buy food. There's an industry metric for this, and it isn't attendance and it isn't box office. They call it per cap, revenue per patron. Second quarter of 2026. AMC's average ticket price, $12.11. Food and beverage per person, $8.08. Cinemark told investors its per-patron concession spending was up more than 50% on 2019. $12 for the ticket, of which you keep a slice. $8 for the corn, of which you keep almost all of it. There's the business. A movie theatre doesn't sell movies. It sells a captive hour in a dark room with a snack bar attached, and it rents the excuse to gather people there from Hollywood. Once you see it, everything else in the building makes sense. Those ads before the trailers aren't filler. National Cinemedia runs its pre-show across more than 17,000 screens in over 1,300 theatres and pulled $93 million in a single quarter. Premium formats charge more for the identical film. Cinemark's Movie Club has 1.45 million members who account for roughly 30% of the company's box office and get nudged toward the expensive screens. None of it is about the movie. All of it is about extracting more per body. So if the model is that clean, why is this industry a graveyard? 3 structural weaknesses, none of them fixable by running a better theatre. 1. You don't control your own inventory. You can't decide what to sell. You sell what Hollywood releases when Hollywood releases it. 2023. The writers and actors strikes shut down production. The films stopped arriving. Thousands of theatres sat with working projectors, trained staff, hot popcorn, and nothing to put on the screen. No other retailer lives like this. A grocery store that loses a supplier finds another supplier. A theatre that loses a slate waits. 2. Your costs don't move when your audience does. The room costs the same whether it holds 300 people or 9. Joe Masher runs Bow Tie Cinemas. He described a 14-screen multiplex with 2 broken projectors, each needing $40,000 in parts. Attendance wasn't high enough to justify fixing them, so they sat mothballed, dead rooms inside a working building. His conclusion was blunt. Above 8 or 10 screens, theatres struggle to fill what they've built. A big multiplex in a shrinking market isn't an asset. It's a heating bill with seats in it. Neither of those is what nearly killed the industry. 3. Your exclusivity was never yours. For decades, a film played only in theatres for roughly 90 days. That was the product, not the seat, not the screen. The 90 days. July 2020. AMC and Universal sign an agreement cutting the window to 17 days, 17 from 90. Now picture the Friday night you're selling. A family of 4 drive across town, find parking, $40, to watch something that will be on their television in 2.5 weeks. Theatre owners spent 5 years trying to claw it back. By 2025, the average window before digital rental had settled around 39 days. Disney, longest among the majors, at just under 62. Then, in 2026, Universal reversed course, committing to a 31-day minimum and 45 days from 2027. 5 years of lobbying to win back the thing they surrendered in a panic. You can survive a weak film year. You can survive an expensive lease. You cannot survive your customers learning they can wait. What happens when all 3 land on the same operator? There are receipts, 3 of them at 3 different sizes. Alamo Drafthouse was the most admired name in American exhibition. Austin, 1997, Tim and Carrie League. They did everything right. Real food and beer at the seat. Phones banned and actually enforced. An audience that showed up for the programming, not just the film. 2021, Chapter 11. Unable to service around $105 million in debt. Then it gets strange. Alamo survives, gets bought out of bankruptcy by private equity, and by 2023 it's beating the entire industry. Box office up around 30% year over year against a market growing 21%. It won. And in June 2024, it sold to Sony for a reported $200 million. Being the best operator in the industry wasn't enough to stay independent in it. Scale up 100 times, same physics. Cineworld, parent of Regal, bankrupt in 2022. AMC, the largest exhibitor on Earth, spent years surviving on capital markets instead of cash flow. By mid-2026, it still carried roughly $3.9 billion in corporate borrowings with a shareholders' deficit of nearly $2 billion earlier that year. Here's the one that should genuinely land. AMC posted a net loss in a quarter where attendance rose 13.5% and revenue hit $1.6 billion. Attendance up, revenue up, loss anyway, because debt doesn't care how good the film slate is. Now the version that never reaches the financial press. Back to Keister, Minnesota. Population 462. Couple buys the theater in 1986, runs it, hands it to a non-profit. And they're not unusual. Theaters in Portland, in Monterey, in Rosendale made the identical conversion. Communities crowdfund $75,000, $100,000, whatever the down payment costs, and take the building into collective ownership. Sit with what that means. The market has quietly ruled that a large share of American cinemas cannot function as businesses at all. They survive as things a town chooses to pay for, like a library, like a park, a beloved chain, a global giant, a single screen in a town of 400. Revenue you share, costs you don't, a product you can't choose, unless for one weekend in 2023 you weren't. One chain got out from under all of it, once. Taylor Swift filmed her tour. Talks with traditional distributors broke down, so she released it through AMC directly, and the terms were unlike anything in the industry. 43% of the gross stayed with theaters. 57% went to Swift and AMC as distributor. Theaters kept every dollar of concessions, and exhibitors had to commit to a minimum 4-week run. $92.8 million domestic opening, biggest ever recorded for a concert film. But the number isn't the point. Look at what actually happened. A theater chain stopped waiting for Hollywood to hand it inventory and went and got its own. For one weekend, an exhibitor controlled what it sold. That's the exception that proves the rule. The only time this industry escapes its own economics is when it stops being a theater business and briefly becomes a distribution business. Everyone else is still waiting for the phone to ring, and there are fewer of them waiting every year. One statistic explains the last decade better than any other. In 2019, 39% of American adults went to the cinema at least once a month. By 2025, 17%. The industry didn't lose the blockbuster audience. Blockbusters still sell out. It lost the person who used to go on a random Wednesday for no particular reason. The rest follows. Just over 41,000 screens in the United States in 2019, around 39,000 by 2022, thousands more dark since. Roughly 1.23 billion tickets sold in 2019 against an estimated 555 million in 2026, while the average price climbed from $9.16 to around $11.31. Fewer people, paying more in fewer rooms. So the survivors stopped selling movies and started selling occasions, premium formats, recliners that cut a room's capacity in half and double what each remaining seat earns, concert films, anniversary screenings, anything that makes one specific night feel unrepeatable. Unrepeatable is the only product a television still can't copy. So after all of that, what does this actually pay? Real numbers, 3 doors. Door 1. The single screen in a small town, often under a few $100,000 to buy, sometimes far less. Revenue may be $100,000 to $300,000 a year. After film rental, staff, insurance, power, and the projector failure that eventually costs $40,000 in parts, the realistic outcome is roughly break even. Some years you clear $30,000 or $40,000. Some years you don't. Now you know why so many of these end up owned by non-profits. You're not buying an income, you're buying a landmark and a job. Door 2, the modern multiplex, 8 to 12 screens, $15 to $25 million in capital between property and equipment. At industry typical performance, revenue around $6 to $9 million a year, concessions supplying roughly a fifth of the top line and close to half the profit. After film rental, payroll, occupancy and maintenance, a well-run property might return $700,000 to $1.2 million, payback stretching past a decade in a business where the release schedule can vanish for 6 months without warning. Door 3, the chain. Here it stops being about theaters at all. AMC generated more than $1.5 billion of revenue in a single quarter of 2026, at an adjusted operating margin above 20%, and still recorded a net loss because it was servicing nearly $4 billion in debt. At that scale, you're not running cinemas, you're running a leveraged real estate and concessions portfolio that happens to project light onto a wall. Same pattern at every size, the operating business works, the capital structure kills you. Which finally explains where we started. A studio spent $200 million on 35 theaters in a shrinking industry, 75 years after being legally forbidden from doing exactly that. Sony didn't buy Alamo Drafthouse because exhibition is a good business. You've just watched 3 sizes of it fail. Sony bought it because whoever owns the room decides how long the film stays in it. That's what 200 million bought. Not seats, not screens, time. And that's the part the fantasy leaves out. You picture yourself owning the movies. What you'll own is a building Hollywood rents at a rate Hollywood sets for as long as Hollywood allows, where your real income arrives 50 cents at a time in a paper bucket. Buy the theater if you love it. Just don't confuse it with buying the show.